Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. If it's your first time here, thanks for joining. Well, this particular vinyl shootout took a bit of time because there are 9, count them 9, different pressings that I was comparing for this. As a matter of fact, I even needed some help from my friend Brad to get through this one. But what album could warrant such a comparison? Well, it's a classic, Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here. And that shootout is coming up next on the Safe and Sound Texas Audio Excursion. This particular album for me is a reflection back to starting college. It was released in September of 1975. Now, Pink Floyd's previous album, Dark Side of the Moon from '73, obviously was a smash. And in fact, some of the songs that were on here were played on their tour when they tried these out on the Dark Side tour. This particular album marked the first time that Pink Floyd was on Columbia Records here in the United States. It also was the first album here where, after Dark Side of the Moon, Alan Parsons was not involved in the engineering as he was getting started on his own musical journey with the Alan Parsons Project. So they went back to Brian Humphreys, who was an engineer with them in the past, and he in fact had the unfortunate event during this recording to having erased a session that was worked on very hard by the band for several hours. So it was amazing to me that he even survived the production. And for me, I will say that I really wish that this album could have had the influence of Alan Parsons in it, because it did have a distinct difference from an engineering perspective to my ears and in my mind. But be that as it may, this was an ode to, in fact, Syd Barrett, the former member of Pink Floyd who had left due to mental illness. The Shine On You Crazy Diamond section of the LP is very much an ode to him and the shining that he did in his life and what he could have done even further. Now, the cynical Have a Cigar on the flip side was, of course, towards the executives, the fat cats, so to speak, the ones who would say, oh, by the way, which one's pink? So again, the band, with especially Roger Waters, always getting in that little bit of a dig in what they were trying to pronounce. But this album was unique in the sense that it wasn't a series of individual songs like Dark Side. It was back to a more conceptual album. And it's one that is very immersive. As it relates to this particular shootout, though, we had quite a few entrants to be able to listen through. And the good news is this album brings about a lot of dynamics. It brings about a lot of quiet segments. It brings about a lot of impactful segments. And it is easy in certain areas to really glean out the differences between the pressings. And in some ways, that made it easy to then say which one of them really didn't make the grade initially when being compared and getting tossed to the side, and then getting a little bit tougher as we got into the ones with the meatier content. And so Brad and I went through these for a long period of time during a long day to get through where we believe this would end up. Now, one of the entrants in here is a double entrant in the sense that it was the CBS half-speed. It was the CBS half-speed mastered. And there were actually 2 releases of that. And the second release of that corrected some equalization that was incorrect against the RIAA standard. And that particular second cut is the more coveted of the 2. And the way you can tell the difference between them is in their catalog ID. The earlier release begins with HC33 and the second release begins with HC43. Now, it's important to look at the dead wax on that record to know for sure what you have, because there was a combination of jackets used, and a combination of inner sleeves used, and a combination of labels used. So to be sure you have that HC43, my suggestion is, of course, to check in the dead wax to be positive what you have. And you'll see as we go through the numbers that it isn't subtle in the difference between the two versions. So, as always, let's take a look at the numbers. The nature of audio comparisons is that the results presented in this video are fully subjective. They are based on my equipment in my listening room using my hearing capability. Therefore, your results may be different. My effort here is to provide you the relative difference of audio characteristics across various pressings. So the contenders for this particular shootout are an original UK first press mastered by Harry T. Moss, or HTM. Had a second pressing UK Harry T. Moss. On the US side, we had a US first pressing with a -1C, didn't indicate the mastering engineer. We had another one that was an original -1C from Columbia Santa Maria as the pressing plant, and a Harry T. Moss, and was purchased as a hot stamper. Those records that are deemed the best of that particular type of album and gone through and then provided at a premium price. A friend of mine loaned me a few of these to add to the shootout. Then we had the US CBS half-speed that was originally released in 1980, which ended up having a bad RIAA equalization curve on it, as it turned out. I didn't know that. I had bought that originally when it came out. Then we had a Japan Master Sound, which are supposed to be cream of the crop. It's a half-speed, and it was a 1980 release, and a plain old vanilla Japanese reissue as well. And then my buddy Brad brought the CBS half-speed corrected version with the fixed RIAA curve, the HC43 prefix on the catalog code versus mine, which was an HC33. That was released in 82, 2 years after the original half-speed. And then we had the worldwide released in 2016 of a reissue that was digital, and it was Bernie Grundman and James Guthrie. So on the quietness of the vinyl, you can see on the UKs, they were an 8.5, whereas the USs were an 8. They were a little bit noisier. But when we got to the half-speed US, it was a 9. And then the Japanese went up a notch to 9.5 for each of those. Again, the redone CBS half-speed was a 9. And then the worldwide reissue was quiet. I mean, a really well done 9.5 for quietness on the copy that I got. As it relates to bass, we found that the first pressing from the UK definitely had stronger bass than the second, a 9.5 versus 8.5, so a fairly distinct difference. And on the US side, we found that the Harry T. Moss out of Columbia Santa Maria hot stamper was slightly better at a 9.5 than the US -1C at a 9. The bass on the half-speed first version coming out from CBS was only an 8. It was weaker in this area by comparison. And ironically, but not surprisingly to some degree, the Japan Master Sound wasn't quite up to that either. It was only an 8.5. But again, historically, Japanese pressings tend to be a little lighter on the bass. So that wasn't a total shock. But the reissue from Japan was woefully missing bass. It was really destroyed, in my opinion, some of the track value in areas where the bass was to be pronounced. It really was problematic. However, the CBS half-speed redo, the fixing the RIAA in 82, it was very good, very clean, very distortion-free, and very solid on the bass. And that was really a strong suit for that record. So really, it really got the best rating aside from that hot stamper that we saw that got a 9.5 as well. And then the worldwide reissue, the 2016, was an 8.5. It was decent, but it wasn't really anything to write home about. As it came to the mid-range, we had, again, a little better on the first pressing of the UK, getting a 9, and the second press an 8.5. And the US OG, similar half-point difference between the original that I had that wasn't from Columbia Santa Maria, and we're not sure who the mastering engineer was on it, versus the Harry T. Moss hot stamper coming in at 9.5. Again, some weakness there on the first CBS half-speed. The Japanese, the master sound, surprisingly, the instruments at the mid-range were lacking on this particular pressing, which was surprising, honestly. The Japanese reissue was not strong in this area either. It was very similar to the master sound, actually. But when we get to the US CBS half-speed that was fixed, the HC43 prefix, a 9.5 there, very strong. That record really was very well defined and presented. And the 2016, again, lacked a bit compared to the half-speed and some of the others, but it did manage an 8.5. On the treble side, the UK first press was a 9, and the second press an 8.5. Again, just a little stronger on that original one. More of a sheen and more presence to the instrumentation. On the US side, however, it seemed like they both were about the same when it came to this side of the spectrum. They both were about a 9, which was very decent, of course, but the hot stamper didn't have the advantage this time. They were pretty much equal in this area. And again, the CBS half-speed with the problem in the equalization, again, only pulled up an 8 on this one, whereas the master sound was really surprisingly poor. For usually Japanese are better at the brightness than they are at anything else. And this one was very lackluster, surprisingly. That series typically has a good reputation, but on this particular record, on the copy I had, it was very lackluster. As was, even worse, the other Japanese reissue, which wasn't a master sound, but it only got a 7 versus a 7.5 for the master sound. So very, very weak there, ironically. Whereas the CBS half-speed master that was fixed, the 82, again, 9.5. Very solid sound, very precise cymbals, very clean top end, and it was really, really well put together, and it held its own very strongly across the board here. And the reissue in 2016 got an 8.5. It was decent, but again, when you play this US half-speed against it, you see the difference pretty clearly. The soundstage and imaging for these respective recordings are, for the UK's, we got an 8.5 for both of those. On the US originals, we got a 9 for the Dash 1C, but the hot stamper was a little bit better. Maybe that's being, stamped at Columbia Santa Maria. You never know. That could be, in fact, a difference there. They really had a great reputation. As it related to the original half-speed from CBS, it got an 8, as did the Japan Master Sound. The Japanese reissue got a 7. It was flat out problematic across the board, as you can start to see here. But when we got to the corrected half-speed by CBS, again, a 9.5. This one really did have definition and openness and some depth to it that defined it much stronger than the competition. And again, the 2016 was decent, 8.5, but again, it's good that it's clean. It's a newer product. It's a 9.5 on the vinyl, so it is quieter in areas, of course, which is great, but it didn't really have the same jump out at you effect that the CBS half-speed corrected version did. And then when we get to dynamic range, we got a lot of 9s there on the first ones in the UK and the US. They were similar. The half-speed for the US that first came out was a little less dynamic, as was the Japanese master sound, and getting 8s, but then the reissue from Japan was a little worse, even at 7.5, whereas the US CBS half-speed redo was a 9, and dynamic range was really good on this remaster done Bernie Grundman and James Guthrie in 2016. It definitely had great dynamics, actually. The voices were pretty common on the UK ones, not hugely impressive, just didn't quite have the same impact, even as the US did on the first issue at a 9, and then that hot stamper from Columbia Santa Maria at 9.5. We get to the CBS half speed, the first one that I've got, it was even worse than those. It was an 8. That equalization, I'm sure, hurt it in the production of the record. The master sound was only able to muster an 8.5, and its ugly stepsister, second release or whatever reissue that was, it was really not strong in this area and got a 7. So obviously that Japanese reissue we're seeing is one to avoid. The CBS half speed with the fixed EQ, it was the best. It was strong like the hot stamper was. It was a 9.5 with voices. And again, back to that 2016, 8.5, decent, but not exactly the winner. So in the end, you can see here with these totals, when we look at all the rankings, including Quiet Vinyl, the CBS half-speed redo, the HC 43453, comes in at a strong 9.36, and that hot stamper is the only other one to get over 9 at 9.14. So you can see that that's basically where we have the hottest spots as it relates to this. Now, the 2016 is pretty decent. I mean, 8.7, the cost of this one's going to be, $40, $30 in that range new. So, some of these others are a little harder to acquire a little more cost potentially. And then when we look at taking the Quiet Vinyl out of the picture, you still can see that the CBS half speed is first, the second one that was done. And then we have the hot stamper, and then the US OG that I have, it squeaked back up in those numbers in a 9.0 for the Quiet Vinyl included in the calculation. So as it relates to this, you can see that overall, this US CBS half-speed fix is really the one that took home the gold. So what do you think about the outcome? These always have some surprises built in them. And remember, your mileage may vary. Your system, your room, the way you hear, the way you like the sounds, all influence our perception of what we hear and how we conclude what sounds best to us. So no one authority always knows what the outcome's going to be. So just realize that this is really about the relative difference between these, and you too can make those comparisons. Now, if you find that a lot of times, for example, what I find is similar to what you found, then maybe we have similar perceptions in that regard, systems in that regard, and outcomes. But there's never 100% way to know for sure. It's all about the individual being there, listening to the music, and coming to some conclusion. I will say that the method I have, being able to A/B these so quickly, does give an advantage to the fact that it is more of a real-time check. Remembering what we heard, keeping that in their mind, and then comparing it isn't always the best way to do it. But this is fun, but the music is what's important. So enjoy it no matter what. As always, thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so by clicking on the bell below, and a like or thumbs up is appreciated, as are your comments. I also would appreciate if you could go and share this with your friends. Let them know about the channel. We're almost at 5,000 subscribers, and we're going to have a big show with some prizes for that show. So stay tuned in the next few months for that to come along. So until we meet next time, thanks for joining me again at the Safe and Sound Texas Audio Excursion. Take care, everybody.